Hi, this is attorney Rachelle Miller, and I wanted to pop on because I think I have found the one word that encapsulates most of our social justice issues. One word. And you know where I ran across this one word? It was in my devotional time. Uh, so I'm going to take you to where I found it to give you the context for where I got this one word. Um, and I'm going to go to the Old Testament to Moses in Deuteronomy, the first chapter. So if you've heard of Moses, you know that he's the guy that gave the Ten Commandments. And after the Ten Commandments, there were moments or times where he would bring the Israelites together to discuss what he believes that God said. And so this is one of those times. And so I'm just going to read two verses out of Deuteronomy, the first chapter, to get to the bottom of this one word and again, the context for where I got it. And so I'm going to read. Again, this is Deuteronomy, first chapter, and I'm going to start at verse 16. I'm going to read verses 16 and 17, and that'll be it. So starting at 16, and I charged your judges at that time. Well, let me back up here, give you a little bit more context for this. This time when he brought the Israelites together to discuss what God said, it was in the context of talking about choosing leaders. And in the course of this conversation about leaders, he gets to judges. And so this is where we pick up at at verse 16. And I charged your judges at that time, hear the disputes between your people and judge fairly. Whether the case is between two Israelites or between an Israelite and a foreigner residing among you. What does that sound like? A foreigner residing among you. That's an immigrant. Maybe what we call in the law a legal resident alien. So moving to verse 17, do not show partiality in judging. Hear both small and great alike. Do not be afraid of anyone, for judgment belongs to God. So I'll pause there. Can you take a guess at which word really jumps out and what may be the basis of all of our social justice issues? I won't hold you in suspense. That word is partiality. Partiality. And let's talk about a quick definition of what partiality is. Partiality means that you have favor towards one thing or group or person over another. Some synonyms for partiality is bias, prejudice, favor. But either way, you prefer one thing, person, or group over the other. Okay? So when we go and look at these two verses, he tells his judges that, number one, I need you to judge the disputes between the people fairly. That's first and foremost. Judge fairly. And I don't want you to think about, I want you to judge fairly regardless of, is this one of your brethren from among you, someone that is from your group or your nation or who looks like you, or a foreigner who gets to live among you, an immigrant. I don't want you to judge those cases any different just because one person is a foreigner versus a native-born person. And then that's where he goes to do not show partiality in judging. I want you to hear the small and great cases alike. I don't want you to treat folks with money any differently from someone who is poor. I don't want you to treat or judge differently anyone who is powerful versus someone that you perceive as helpless. I want you to judge this all the same. Do not show partiality. Do you think these mandates of not showing partiality and judging fairly, are these the things that you see happening in our society today? If you're paying attention, no. No, let's talk about it. Let's get into it. When I say I think it encapsulates most of our social justice issues, let me run down a couple of them. So you might can tell that I'm a woman, hopefully. So women who are, well, women are suing the FBI right now. That was a headline that came out today because they feel like men and women are not being treated fairly, or they were sexually harassed. Uh, Also, along the lines of women, you hear a lot of the protests about uh, the pay and wage gap disparity, getting 60 to 70 cents on a dollar for what a man gets for, he gets that full dollar. And so when it comes to a lot of the social justice issues surrounding women, they feel like someone is receiving favor over them. They don't feel like the law or the rules are being equally applied. Let's talk about some other groups. What do you think the Black Lives Matter folks were talking about? They see the partiality in the systems. They see people being treated differently, or groups being treated more favorably over the others, or another group being more criminalized over another. And that partiality is the basis of the protest. An example, uh, in the Black Lives Matter movement, you have folks who are watching a man get choked to death in public on a main street for selling loose cigarettes. Meanwhile, you're watching a man who is white, who just murdered multiple people, get brought into custody without incident and alive. They see a big, big disparity. I lived in Texas for over 12 years, and so I would hear phrases like driving while brown. I would pass this one street, and the courthouse, the traffic courthouse, happened to be on the street, and you would see folks lined up in a long line, waiting for their turn to get into the courthouse, because the line was formed because the courthouse wasn't open yet, but traffic court was very early. And you could just look in that line. Houston is a very diverse city, but you would see a disparate number of Hispanic folks in that line, minorities in that line, but white people live in Houston. So when it comes to maybe some Hispanic brothers and sisters, some of the things I would hear in Texas in my tenure there, do you think they feel like they're being treated the same? Or is there partiality for another group? Is another group getting favor? Or is the law being applied the same? And I'll tell you this, I'll go back to the Bible for a moment. Whenever you have a situation, even in homes, where a person feels like someone else is favored over the other, and you can see this isn't their imagination, there's a drastic favor, it causes chaos. Think of how Joseph and his brothers, the dynamics there. Joseph was the favorite. It was clear. The Bible talks about and says explicitly that Joseph was the favorite. He's the one that got the coat of many colors. He got the freshest clothes, the coolest clothes. He was telling his brothers that they would bow to him, and that was encouraged. How did the brothers perceive that? They despised it. And Joseph turned out to be a great hero, and has a great biblical story, and his story is one of my favorites. But when you talk about that partiality and favor being shown in the home and being treated differently, I can relate to those brothers. They had a just cause. And so that one word again is partiality. It is the root of so many of our issues. And even when we talk about the issue of affirmative action, there was some backlash because although affirmative action was enacted to sort of level the playing field, open up opportunities for folks who had been historically discriminated against, there became a sentiment here recently that, you know, people felt like that group was being preferred over them. People, white people felt like the affirmative action programs were showing partiality to another group. And so you have all of these dynamics, but that partiality, the bias, the favoritism, and another word that we throw around in our vernacular is privilege. Privilege is another way of saying the system and the laws favor you. And let's talk about the laws and how things are not necessarily equal. You have to have money just to run for office. So number one, who is entitled or who gets to even make laws? There's bias in that. There's partiality in favor in that. And then two, the content of laws. There's partiality and bias in who gets to have a voice in what the content of the law says. And then thirdly, there is bias in how those laws that are created are enforced. Some groups are disproportionately criminalized, arrested, stopped, and searched more than other groups. So the enforcement of those laws, it's not equal. And that is a source of protest in our country. That partiality is felt. And then lastly, when those laws are broken, there is a disparity in the severity of the punishments that are levied for breaking the law. Some people are, or some groups are, sentenced more harshly than others. And other folks are given favor and preferential treatment over another group. But this lack of equal scales or uneven weights in the way that we measure one another, it is a core, it is a bedrock of our criminal justice issues, some of our civil rights issues. It's a problem, partiality. And so I think as a citizen, what you can do on the ground, you don't have to be a person who's run for office or anything like that. You in your personal life can start treating people and judging people similarly, but by the same standards. And do that in your day-to-day life, in your homes, with your children, your neighbors, your church folks. Don't necessarily judge somebody who's from a different country differently than, someone that you think is native born. And if you work someplace and you're in management, or, even if you're a coworker, you can treat people and weigh them with the same scales and not be under a cloud of bias, prejudging, showing favoritism and preferential treatment. But when we do see those things, we also have the obligation to identify it and to speak up about it and not stay silent and complicit about it. And we need to expect that our institutions and our governments also stop playing in partisanship happens to be another synonym for partiality. Partisanship. And that's a great word for our nation at this point in time. Partisanship is a form of partiality. It is literally a synonym for partiality. And so in our governments, we need to hold, no matter what party you're in, you need to be held to the same standards. Right now, if we're honest, the standards and the weights that we're using to judge our current president are certainly different than the standards that we used to judge our previous president. And entirely different. The weights are nowhere near the same. And for that, our country should repent. And some of the same folks right now who, when we look at our headlines, who are demanding justice and accountability for the Jussie Smollett case, are some of the same folks who are highly supportive of a president who is obstructing justice in plain sight. And if you read the Mueller report, They talk about destroying evidence and so forth and so on. And it's no secret that our president does not want to turn over financial documents or tax returns. That's been not something that's odd that we've asked of our presidents. It has been a long-standing tradition, and mostly every single president has done that. But no. So the scales that we use, we are guilty of partiality, and God is not pleased with it. He doesn't like it. He sat here and told us in Deuteronomy that when it comes to judging, that we should use the same scale, weigh the small and great alike. And we have not been doing that as a country, as a society, as Christians, as pastors, as leaders. We haven't been doing that. And we are wrong. We are absolutely, unequivocally wrong when we do that. And so I'm challenging you as an individual, as a leader, and even in the way we hold our government accountable, do better. It is sin for us to operate in partiality. Do you see how much confusion and division and chaos it causes us as a society? And so start where you are and try to do the just scales in your own life and hold our leaders accountable under the same standards and speak out against it, the partiality, when we see it. We have to. If we want our society to be better, we have to.